This is a lecture by L. Ron Hubbard given on the 20th of August, 1954. The title of this lecture is Axioms Part 3. This lecture is 29 minutes long. Reproduced by Golden Era Productions.
I want to talk to you now some more about the axioms. We've gotten up to the axioms of affinity, reality, and communication. These subjects are very inherent. For instance, in Scientology, they're terrifically useful. If you want to find where a communication line is breaking, why, look for some affinity that is off. And if you want to audit somebody who is having a rather rough time, then you'd better audit them with considerable affinity. If you demonstrate enough affinity one way or the other, why, you will be able to overcome their communication reluctance. But it's very important that you understand that all these things are basically a consideration. We have to consider that they exist before they exist. Now, we are covering on this track the considerations which man has composited into an existence. Man has decided that certain things existed, and so he has agreed upon this very thoroughly, and so they exist for all of men. And if he had never decided upon these various existences, why, they wouldn't exist. So we look at this affinity, and we find out that we look at reality and communication too, and we find out that we are looking at a long series of considerations which man holds in common. These are not considerations simply because we in Scientology consider that they exist. We can do enormously important things with this information, this codification organization of this universe. It's been going on for about 76 trillion years, and to be able to bust it loose and knock it apart is quite an interesting feat. All right, let's look over affinity and see that the first thing about affinity is the fact it's consideration, and then that in the ARC triangle, the distance of communication is represented by the affinity to a marked degree. And the type of particle, the distance and the type of particle. For instance, they say absence makes the heart grow fonder. That happens to be a lie, but you could postulate it that way and make it come out. And you could also say that if you get two people far enough apart, why, they're liable to get mad at each other. The main reason you have wars is because Russia is a safe distance from the United States. It can afford to get mad. Did you ever notice that somebody was very furious at you as long as they were on the other end of a telephone line, but when you went around to see them, they weren't mad at you anymore? Well, that's an inversion on the situation. You closed the distance, and so you achieved a better affinity. Many ways that you can handle this, but again, basically it's consideration. Now, let's look at reality. And we find out that reality, in number 26, reality is the agreed upon apparency of existence. The whole subject of reality is a baffling one to people who do not add into reality affinity and communication. If you simply said, well, this is reality, and that's your reality, that's somebody else's reality, and so forth, well, you'd just be talking, that's all. In the first place, a person can postulate anything he wants to postulate, and he has a personal reality. He can simply say it's there, and he say that's real. Or he can have a facsimile appear, which is more real to him than the actual universe around him. Many times you'll run into a psychotic, and his facsimiles are far, far more real than anything else. Well, these are two conditions which we don't recognize as reality. In the one hand, the person merely postulates reality, and so that's his reality, and other people don't agree upon it. And the other part is also a not agreed upon reality, and that is this reality. It's another determined reality. Somebody's given him a facsimile and has really impressed him with it, and so this looks more real to him than reality. In other words, we have complete self-determined postulation and complete other determined postulations, neither one of which are what we consider to be reality. Those are extremes. What we consider to be reality is in the mean of this. That is, what do we agree is real? You and I agree there's a wall there. Well, there's a wall there. And we agree there's a ceiling there. There's a ceiling there. And we agree that you're sitting there and I'm sitting here. Well, that's real. That's simply because you and I safely have agreed that that takes place. Now, if somebody else came in the room and said, looked at all you people sitting down and said, what are you all standing up for? Why, you'd have rather a tendency to believe there was something wrong with this fellow. As a matter of fact, do you know what we do? We use natural selection to take out of the lineup people who have too much personal reality and too much other determined reality. If this person walked in and said, what are all you people standing up for? Why, if he did that consistently about a number of things and said, what is that lion doing walking on the ceiling? We would have a tendency to lock him up. In other words, we would move him away from survival and he wouldn't procreate. In other words, we've moved these people actually out of at least the genetic lineup, the insane. Now, here we have, in reality, a very embracing subject, because reality is actually isness. Reality is isness, and unreality is not isness. Our effort trying to make something disappear with energy, and by the way, that's very amusing, trying to make things disappear with energy. They used to talk in the Bible and other places, and they used to say, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword, and somebody said once, turn the other cheek. And what these people were actually saying was, fighting force with force does not bring about anything like a perfect duplicate. Only they maybe didn't know they were saying that. But using force to fight force brings about an unreality. But oddly enough, using force to build force brings about a reality. Isness is a continuous alteration. Continuous alteration gives us an isness. And a not-isness, saying it doesn't exist, gives us an unreality. So there we have reality and unreality defined. Now, how could you use this principle of reality in auditing? Do you know reality is basically an agreement? A mechanical agreement is for two forms to be exactly similar. In other words, one's a copy of the other form. That's mimicry. And we learn by mimicry. If you go in and find a psychotic prancing up and down a sanitarium room, and you simply start prancing up and down the sanitarium room exactly like he's doing, do you know to stop and talk to you? Well, maybe he hasn't talked to anybody for ages, but certainly he now has an agreed-upon reality. And having agreed upon reality, he can get in communication with it. In other words, mimicry is the lowest level of entrance of a case and is a very good thing for an auditor to know. Now, what we know then as reality is the agreed upon apparency of existence. All right. Now let's take up number 27. An actuality can exist for one individually, but when it is agreed with by others, it can be said to be a reality. And let's find out that those things which have become solid to us, which have become very fixed to us, must have been agreed upon by others. And we get something very interesting there. The anatomy of reality is contained in isness, which is composed of as-isness and alter-isness. And isness is an apparency, not an actuality. The actuality is as-isness altered so as to obtain a persistency. Well, this agreement is part of the as-isness of this whole universe. If you ask somebody, give me some things that you wouldn't mind agreeing with, Give me something that you could do that other people would agree with, and so on. We'll notice some change in the case. Why? We're changing his level of agreement. He is actually bound by certain considerations, and until he postulates otherwise, he will continue with that agreement. This is how we fix somebody into something. The whole of existence actually is run very much like an hypnotic trance. How do you hypnotize somebody? Well, you get them to agree with you. And then you get them to agree with you a little bit more. Most people think that it's done by watches or something or other. It's not done that way. It's done in a very interesting way. I don't know much about Western hypnotism. I myself studied hypnotism in the East, and when I came over to America again, I wondered what on earth this strange practice was that these people were practicing and calling hypnotism, because it wasn't even vaguely what is taught in the East to induce trances. Well, it's quite remarkable that hypnotism is inducible on small or large groups. Now, the worse off a group is, which is to say the less communication they have actually, the more communication can be forced upon them. And you can get a form of hypnotism there. But the interesting thing is that they must have been prepared by an enormous number of agreements before they got into that state. In other words, somebody else prepared them, so they didn't care who they agreed with after a while. Anybody in a uniform walks up to a soldier. If that uniform has a higher rank on the soldier, will obey them. Well, this is a form of hypnotism. Now, you can take an audience and simply get them to agree with you. And you get them to agree more and more and more and more and more. And the next thing you know, and by the way, when I say agree with you, I mean you could get them to agree first that you were simply standing there. And then the next thing that you could get them to agree to is the fact that they were listening to you. And then you would give them a few little things on which they would agree with. The next thing you know, you could tell them that the world was on fire, and the audience would rush out to find out. Or maybe they just sit there and burn. It's quite interesting, but you could move it out that way. Now, what is this all about? Does that mean that anybody bringing about an agreement would bring about hypnotism? Oh, no. The reason why in Scientology we do not bring about an hypnotism, even by opening procedure by duplication, every case 5 that's had this run on him claims it's a way to induce trance. But every single one of the tenets of Scientology could be reversed, and with a bad intention and so forth, could be worked out in the opposite direction. We are undoing the agreements which people have been making for 76 trillion years. Only we're undoing them, so this makes them freer and freer and freer. Now, show you this fellow on the stage who simply gets the audience to agree and agree and agree and agree, and then tells them the place is on fire. Oh, he isn't really going in the direction of making them freer, is he? His intention for this is entirely different. It isn't that an intention is above agreement. It's that consideration is always above agreement. And he is trying to work them into a situation where they will accept what he says without question. We're not interested in Scientology and anybody accepting what we say without question. We ask them to question it. We ask them to please look at the physical universe around you. Please look at people, at your own mind, and understand thereby that what we are talking about happens to be actual. This is the series of agreements. They aren't just fancy ideas. Now, I could get people to agree with me about a lot of things, and every once in a while I could throw them a curve. I could quite imperceptibly introduce a false idea into the science, and maybe somebody less scrupulous might do this. But over a period of 4 years, you can trace back and you find out the only arbitraries I've introduced into the science are that are completely false, or the psychiatrists are no good and the psychologists are stupid. And of course those are completely false. I mean, the fact that psychiatry kills 2,000 people a year with electric shock machines, of course means that they're bettering the community, and they're doing what they should do, and they're humanitarian, and they're not out for money. But introducing ideas like this, I would be apt to get more agreement from people than otherwise. But what I am giving you is not counterthought. If you just kept, fighting the concepts that I gave you all the way up the line, you would just be re-agreeing all over the place. What we're doing here is laying out the map of what's happened in 76 trillion years, and your agreements have finally mounted up to a point where you believe this universe is all here, and what you're agreeing to, fortunately, are the very things which you agreed to. We aren't giving you new things. We're giving you old things. And by understanding these old things, which we have rediscovered, why, you become free. Well, now, what is this feeling of unreality that people get, this unconsciousness and upset condition of forgetfulness and so forth? Well, actually, forgetfulness and so on stems from an effort to make things disappear by pressing against them with energy. We push against a thought, if you can imagine this, and if we push against it hard enough and then say it isn't there while it's still there, why, we will become forgetful, believe me. And if we push hard enough, we will become unconscious. But remember, we had to postulate that we could forget. And we had to postulate that we could become unconscious before either of these things could happen. You know, people roll around waiting to go to sleep. Then they say, I am going to go to sleep. Well, I inspect R240, and you'll understand why. The proper thing to do is simply say, I'm asleep. But they say that's a lie. No, it isn't a lie unless you considered that you were awake. Now, if you said, I am awake and now I am going to sleep, well, of course, you wouldn't go to sleep. Or you might. If you could induce a self-trance, you could. But the point I'm trying to make is that you can make at any moment a prime postulate. Well, more about that later. Well, now you've had considerable about communication. Oh, my, the communication and the formula of communication and duplication and so on in Scientology that we've covered is very great. But let's read again this formula on communication. Communication is the consideration and action of impelling an impulse or particle from source point across a distance to receipt point with the intention of bringing into being at the receipt point a duplication of that which emanated from the source point. Now, understand, we are using this word duplicate as copy. And we have a perfect duplicate, which means as is. Now, that's the way we're using it today. When we say duplicate, we merely mean a copy. We say copy, facsimile, duplicate, we mean pretty much the same thing. And when we're saying perfect duplicate, we mean as is, and we mean the object in its place, in its time, with its own energy. But a duplicate, that is another piece of energy in another space, and so forth, but it's a copy. So we send a telegram from New York City, and it says, I love you, and it arrives in San Francisco, and it says, I loathe you. Something has happened there that we don't get a perfect duplicate. Well, the more mechanical an individual gets, the less he can make a perfect duplication. And so he can't as is, and he falls even off to a point where he can't make an exact copy. So you say, go around the corner and tell Betty I love her, and he goes around the corner and says, Joe said to tell you he loathes you. And he's perfectly happy doing this. We get a line of soldiers, and we whisper a message, H hour is at 10 o'clock. Now, you're supposed to whisper that to the next soldier, and it goes through a dozen soldiers this way. We find out at the other end we had beans for suppers, the message which they claim was put on the line. This is an inability to make copies. And this is the most disruptive thing and the most significant thing about communication. The formula of communication for your own use and so forth is simply cause, distance, effect, with a good copy and effect of that which was at cause. That's all you really need to know about communication. All right. There's much more to that in the manual, and you will understand much more about communication. Now, 29 is another axiom about as-isness and persistence. And it tells you why people have to mock up another creator and so forth than themselves for their own creations. In order to get a persistence, they have to assign another authorship to the creation, and so on. They have to say it's other responsibility. That's so that when they look at it, they won't make an as-is of it. You see, if they said that I made it and now I look at it, why, that'd be very bad. But they said if they created something and then they said Bill made it, then when they look at it, why, they say Bill made it. But that's a lie. So we get persistence stemming out of a second postulate, a lie. They made it, then they said somebody else made it. And so we get persistency stemming out from any lie. Now we get number 30. The general rule of auditing is that anything which is unwanted and yet persists must be thoroughly viewed, at which time it will vanish. And we know that, of course, in the line of duplicates, perfect duplicates. Now, 31. Goodness and badness, beautifulness and ugliness are alike considerations and have no other basis than opinion. And 32. Anything which is not directly observed tends to persist. In other words, if you don't as-is it, and you've already said it's going to be there, why, naturally, it will be there. But this is worse than that. You get somebody working at his work, and he's never paying any attention to the machine. He's always paying some attention to the work. We'll find he has facsimiles of the machine, just all stacked up like mad. He's never as-is the machine. We get somebody who's always looked at lighted objects in dark rooms, has never looked at the darkness. He will eventually see nothing but darkness when he closes his eyes. He'll have a black bank, in other words. 33. Any as-isness which is altered by not-isness tends to persist. In other words, if we use force on something, we will get a persistence. Now we're going to go into something which is tremendously interesting because it is the proof of the fact that we have reached an ultimate truth and an ultimate solution. And that ultimate truth and so on is itself very, very important to an auditor, because that tells you whether or not Scientology is a total subject. I used to show you a circle and showed you just before you got to the top point of the circle, all data was known. When you got to the top point of the circle, no data was known. And then you had to start out with a new data again. You went around the circle up to the point where all data was known. Then you came up to the top again, and you got one datum known, then you got no data known and one datum known. You see that? It was a circle. Everything known and nothing known were adjacent. Well, we've reached that point in Scientology. That's because all truth is a static, and the ultimate solution is a static. Naturally, the solution to a problem is the as-isness of the problem. By solution to the problem, we mean what will cause this problem to dissipate and disappear. Well, the as-isness of the problem will cause it to dissipate and disappear, so therefore we have reached the solution of all problems. We've also reached an ultimate truth. Now let's go into this ultimate truth just a little bit. The remainder of the axioms are devoted to this. And I'm just going to take it up with a very fast explanation rather than go into the remainder of these axioms, because you have them, after all, in your handbook. It was entered like this. Stupidity is the unknownness of consideration. Suddenly realized that. The stupidity, that's the unknownness of a consideration. You don't know what he was thinking about. You don't know what he was talking about. You don't know what it meant. Well, that means it's the unknownness of consideration. Well, mechanically, the mechanical definition of stupidity is the unknownness of time, place, form, and event. See, a fellow's really stupid. He knows something happened, but he doesn't know what happened. He can't add it up. He can't do anything with it. All right, now we say truth is the exact consideration. That's the consideration. Now, mechanically, truth is the exact time, place, form, and event. Aha, truth is the exact time, place, form, and event. Well, wait a minute. We say truth is the exact consideration. Well, all right, it's the exact consideration. The truth of the fellow saying I am a man is, the truth is I am a man. That's the first postulate. Now, he says I am a man, so he's a man. That's the exact consideration. He cannot tell a lie until he has said, I am a man, and then he has masked or hidden the fact that he is a man, and he says, I am a woman. Now, the odd part of it is that he made a truth when he made the first postulate. And that which denied that truth then persisted. The second postulate always persists. I give you R240. The dissertation in R240 in the handbook makes this much clearer, but just look at that. The second postulate persists, not the first one. The second postulate introduces time. Now, persists is time, that's all. Mortality, immortality, this is a matter of time. It's also a matter of identity, but it's basically a matter of time. That which is persisting means that which is timing. And if you have assumed that after you made a postulate, you then had something which permitted you to make another postulate, you'd have to postulate time there, wouldn't you? Oh, that's quite interesting. So that your second postulate then introduces time. Merely because it's a second postulate, you had to introduce time. See, there is no time in the static natively. Time is just a consideration. All right, so you introduce time. You get a lie. This is mechanical, by the way. This is the way it works. You make a second postulate in front of the first postulate. It's the second postulate which persists, but it derives its strength from the first postulate. There's a large dissertation on this in R240. And I give you that for your consideration. But the way we entered into the solution of the subject of Scientology and life was this. Again, I give you this. Stupidity is the unknownness of consideration. Well, then truth is the knownness of the consideration, isn't it? Well, right back there we have that perfect duplicate. Right back on the line, we found out that when you got the as-isness of anything, if you made a perfect duplicate of it, it would disappear, wouldn't it? So, truth is a perfect duplicate. But that's a disappearance. Well, if that's a disappearance, then all you've got left is the static. So truth is a static. And it follows through just as clearly as that. It's a mechanical proof. It's as mechanical as any kind of proof you wanted in any field of mathematics. It's totally mechanical. Now, again, a problem is a solution only when you get the as-isness of the problem. Is that right? Problem is the solution, we get the as-isness of the problem. Therefore, what do we got left? We got the as-isness of the problem. We have nothing left. Oh, but we don't have nothing. We have a static. So we find out that the ultimate truth is also the basic truth. Contains no time, no motion, no mass, no wavelength. And we find the ultimate solution contains no time, no mass, no wavelength. It's very interesting, isn't it? Very, very fascinating. So we come back to something which is not an imponderable. Does and can one of these statics exist? Yes. That too we can subject to proof. And we can subject it to proof immediately, instantly, and easily. Nothing to it. You just ask somebody who's not in too bad a condition to be 3 feet back of your head. You can ask him to be anywhere, to appear anywhere in the universe, and he can. You ask him to manufacture space and energy, and he can. In other words, you can inspect actually whether or not this is taking place, and you will find out that it is taking place. And you'll find out that man is basically a static. So, he doesn't move, he appears. Now, therefore, we have this thing called the static. We have this thing called the perfect duplicate, the as-isness. So therefore, we have this thing called an ultimate truth, and we have an ultimate solution. Now, I say in Scientology that we have wrapped it up. There are many strong points on the track where there's a lot of data hidden and chaoses and confusions and that sort of thing, which we've bypassed, a lot of things which we haven't described adequately. For instance, I'm not even satisfied at this moment completely with affinity and our description of affinity. But I can tell you this, that they are bypassed points. The other evening at 2 o'clock in the morning, I suddenly found myself out at the edge of a cliff looking at end of track. It is end of track. That's right. There was no more road. There isn't any more road out there, that's all, because we've come back to the static. And we find out what this static is. We can demonstrate its existence. We can demonstrate what it does. We can prove it. And we can all agree upon that proof. And we can do wonderful and miraculous things with it. The 40 processes contained in the auditor's handbook can do those things, just like that. Now, if you can do the first few of those processes well, certainly up to process 20, you will be doing very, very well. If you understand this whole subject, why, come down to Phoenix and I will give you a DSCN. But if you could pass the CECS with great ease, without any further training, we would be very surprised people. Very, very surprised people. Okay.
This is a lecture by L. Ron Hubbard given on the 20th of August, 1954. The title of this lecture is Axioms Part 4. This lecture is 28 minutes long. Reproduced by Golden Era
Now I want to
Productions.
talk to you a little bit more about the axioms and to take up particularly this matter of truth and its use in auditing. You see, any problem of any character is the basic business of the Scientologist. So therefore, if he wants to know about solutions, you had certainly better give him the solution of problems, and that, of course, would be a basic and ultimate truth. Well, if we can describe a basic and ultimate truth and describe it exactly, why, we have no problem at all in solving problems. All right. Now, let's go over this again. We see that failure to discover truth brings about stupidity. A person begins to believe he's stupid if he can't, as is truth. All right. Now we see that the discovery of truth would bring about an as-isness by actual experiment, and thus we see that an ultimate truth would have no time, place, or form. In other words, it would just, whatever we had there would simply disappear if we discovered an ultimate truth, so the ultimate truth is a perfect duplicate, and therefore the ultimate truth is a static. And the operation to achieve a static would be a perfect duplicate. Now we see very much then that lying, as we understand it, is an alteration of time, place, event, or form, and that is a lie. And only lies persist. We have to have a basic postulate and then another postulate before we get time. You have to have two postulates to have time. We can't have time with one postulate unless it is the postulate that there will be time. That could be one postulate. But normally in operation we find that two postulates are necessary to achieve time. Well, now, which one of these postulates is going to persist if the two postulates deny each other? The second one is going to persist, because it is the time postulate. It said first there was a second postulate, so therefore we have time taking place. So lying becomes an alter-isness and becomes stupidity. In other words, we don't discover where the thing is, we don't discover exactly how it was, so we can't unmock it. So there we are. And the only thing that we can do with it, possibly, is to not is it, or alter it some more, or stir it around, or do what a black 5 does with it. Just stirs it around and hopes it'll disappear, and so forth. He doesn't as is it, and so it doesn't disappear. Well, now, the funny part of it is that lying will develop into a stupidity. It also develops into a mystery, and it also develops into this blackness which individuals are so upset about. And it's just an alteration of time, place, event, or form after the fact of its having been created. This is a mechanical lie, and by the way, does not lead to blackness. There'll be two kinds of lies here. Mechanical lie. We mock up some space, and we put an object in that space, and then we move it. Well, the moment we've moved it, we've lied about it. We've said it's over there, whereas, as a matter of fact, it was created in location 1. Now, in view of the fact that there's only consideration, this, of course, would bring about a lie, but really, it doesn't disappear, it doesn't do anything peculiar simply by moving it around. We say it's in another location, and that of course, gives us a mechanical lie. So that the mere handling of energy does not bring about a lie. It takes another consideration than simply moving something to bring about an occlusion. All right. Now, anything which persists must avoid as-isness, and thus anything to persist, really to persist, must contain a lie. Now, we get axiom 39. Life poses problems for its own solution. Aha, life poses problems for its own solution. Now, what do we find? What do we find here in a problem? We find something which is persisting, the as-isness of which cannot be attained. And that would be the definition of a problem. Something which is persisting, the as-isness of which cannot be attained. Easily be attained, that is. And that would be a problem. Now, to solve that problem, it would be necessary to get its as-isness. Well, how do we prevent, then, something from being as-ised? In other words, vanished. We introduce a lie into it. So all problems contain a lie. Any problem to be a problem must contain a lie. If it were truth, it would unmock, and that's axiom 40. So we get that any problem to be a problem has to contain a lie. So actually, when you're studying a pre-clear's bank, and you're trying to process pre-clear, and that pre-clear's being a problem, we know very well that there's a lie someplace on the track that he's trying to obtain the as-isness of. It's not necessarily his lie, but it certainly is a lie. An unsolvable problem would have the greatest persistence. It would also contain the greatest number of altered facts, and to make a problem, one must introduce alter-isness. In other words, this problem must have been moved and shifted and shoved around considerably to be unsolvable. Now, axiom 41, that which alter-isness is introduced into becomes a problem. Anytime you alter something, you've got a problem on your hands. Thus, this whole universe, then, is a problem, and also this whole universe must contain a lie to go on persisting the way it does. Well, believe me, it contains enough alterisms, so it certainly does contain a lie. It also contains a variety of lies about its creation and all that sort of thing. I mean, there's a lot of things about this universe that make it persist, and all of those things boil down to one fact, that it must be based upon a lie, and it must be very definitely altered. Now, axiom 41 tells us that it was alteration which brought the pre-clear into being a problem. Thus, we find any child that has been moved extensively, who has had its home changed, who has been shoved around to various parts of the world, eventually becomes a problem, first to environment and then to himself. Naturally, he's just been altered in space a lot, so he becomes a problem. Now we discover in 42 that matter, energy, space, and time, MEST, in other words, persists because it is a problem. Your physicist is busily at work trying to unmock this, but he's unmocking it by not-isness. He's using force to alter force. And because he keeps altering it, it naturally will get worse and worse. Now, he will solve nothing with an atom bomb. He will simply make things worse, more complicated, more confused, and more dispersed. The atom bomb is a dead-end track and is folly. It is great folly. It would merely add more confusion. If an atom bomb were introduced into a war, by the number of particles and the amount of MEST which would be altered, we would discover immediately that it would have introduced a great number of lies into the situation. It would have deteriorated the society and everything else. If we were foolish enough, for instance, to atom bomb Russia, or if Russia were foolish enough to atom bomb the U.S., enough confusion would have been introduced into the cultures of Earth so that probably there would be no other choice but to sink into a barbarism. In the absence of an understanding of life itself, this is exactly what would have happened. Now we get here number 43. Time is the primary source of untruth. Time states the untruth of consecutive considerations. And I call your attention very definitely to interest as an interesting thing to observe. Now, there are two classes of interest. And we want to know why we're thinking about this in terms of time. It's because time is the basic lie behind all lies. That is to say that you have consecutive moments. We believe they're consecutive moments. We see consecutive motions and so forth, and this is all very pleasant. We agree to this. It's only when we have masked them with some vicious intent that we really get a kickback from the progress of time. But we discover here in the matter of interest that we have two facets. One is interested, and the other is interesting. Now, a thetan is interested, and an object is interesting. A thetan is not interesting. He is interested. And when a person becomes terribly interesting, he has lots of problems, believe me. There are lots of problems whenever somebody becomes interesting. So that is the chasm that is crossed. That is the chasm which is crossed by all of your celebrities. Anybody who is foolish enough to become famous, he crosses over from being interested in life to being interesting. And people who are interesting are really no longer interested in life. It's very baffling to some young fellow why he can't make some beautiful girl interested in him. Well, she's not interested, she is interesting. And so, of course, she can't be interested. Now, let's take axiom 44 and see how all this adds up here in processing. Theta, the static, has no location in matter, energy, space, or time, but is capable of consideration. Now, we've already had that, but we put it in there again just to drive it home in this regard. Hasn't any time. There's no time in this static. Time is a lie. Time can be postulated by the static, but is only a consideration, and thereafter a static gets the idea, a thetan gets the idea that he is persisting across a span of time, and he's not. He's not persisting. Objects are going across time, and energies and spaces are changing, and so forth, but he isn't. At no time does he ever change. He has to consider he's in a head before you can put him out of one. He has to consider he is out of his head before he can be out of his head. Step 5 is quite interesting. He is always thinking that the auditor is going to reach in and pull him out of his head. You know, he's waiting for something else to do it. How could anything else do it? Nothing else could do it. Nothing under the sun could do it. Of course, you could probably hypnotize him and tell him that he was, and he'd probably react in various ways. But he has to say, I am now out of my head, and he will be out of his head. But if he waits to see whether or not he's out of his head or not, why, it becomes complete nonsense. The only way that he can get anything done is to consider that it is done, or consider that that is the condition which exists. All right. Number 45. Theta can consider itself to be placed, at which moment it becomes placed, and to that degree a problem. Anytime we fall away from axiom 1, which is repeated as axiom 44, we discover that we have less of a static than before. In other words, we just place this static, and it's less of a static than it was before. Fascinating, isn't it? But a thetan then can have a problem just by being placed. And quite in addition to that, he ceases to be quite as interested. Now, he himself, for instance, placing himself, can get away with this. This isn't very hard for him to do. And he can perceive from this new place and so forth. But as long as he is placed, he will be less than a static. Just remember that. Now, it is to that degree a problem. To the degree that it has time in it, it's a problem. Now, 46. Theta can become a problem by its considerations, but then becomes messed. What is this messed? What is it? Let's look at that very closely, and let's find that an interested thetan is a thetan, but an interesting thetan has become messed. What is messed? Well, it's actually simply a composite of energies and particles and spaces which are agreed upon and which are looked at. Now, we have the difference between inflow and outflow. A thetan who is being interesting is simply outflowing. Pardon me, is interested, he's outflowing. Interested, outflowing. Interesting, inflowing. See, he wants the attention of others to flow to him. Interesting. That's messed. Attention of others flow to it. That doesn't tell you that all messed is a series of trapped thetans. It says that it is a type of life which is being interesting, as opposed to something which is being interested in it. Now, Number 46, theta can become a problem by its considerations, but then becomes mest, is followed by this, that mest is a problem and will always be considered a problem and is nothing else but a problem. Mest is that form of theta which is a problem. That's all. Therefore, it is that form of theta which has a lie introduced into it. And so, of course, it's a problem. Now, number 47, theta can resolve problems. And 48, life is a game wherein theta as the static solves the problems of theta as mest. Now, that means that theta is the static and theta is the object. Yes, indeed. It can be both ways. It just depends on which one is being interested and which one is being interesting. And we find then that a pre-clear gets more and more solid and more solid. The more interesting he becomes, and the more problem he becomes, the more problems he has, and the more figuring he does in these problems, of course, the more solid he is going to get. Now, 49, to solve any problem, it is only necessary to become theta, the solver, rather than theta, the problem. Now, believe me, that's a very, very important axiom. That tells you why SOPHC opening procedure works. Because the main form of theta, which we find desirable, which has mobility, which has freedom, which is happy, which is cheerful, which has all those points on the top of the chart of attitudes and so forth, is an observer of problems and a solver of problems. So if you get somebody simply to look around the environment, he will cease to be a problem and become the solver of problems. That's all. Just like you get him to look around and recognize a few problems, and he'll feel better. You get somebody working then who is worrying about himself, worry. Well, he's all mixed up in a problem. He's right next door to a problem. His affinity is a closure with this problem. He's having an awful time. He's all bedded down and so forth. Well, let's take this and turn it around the other way, and let's have him observe himself as a problem. And we get that part of the process, which is problems and solutions. And naturally, if we ask a thetan to be a solution often enough, he would eventually become a static. That's all. If we ask him to observe problems long enough, he would simply become a static. In other words, he would go out of it both ways. A theta could become a problem, more of a problem, more of a problem, more of a problem, more static. See, he could go out the bottom. Or he could say less of a problem, less static. You see, you could go either ways. So there is no hope for you. You're going to survive anyway, and so are your pre-clears. But we're going to have a better world doing it. Now, number 50, theta as mest must contain considerations which are lies. In other words, there isn't a single piece of mest in the world which isn't to some degree or another lying. All right, now let's look at that then and find then the only crime that you could possibly commit is being there. I don't care where. This is the only crime that you could commit. And this is all your parents objected to, and this is all your pre-clear's parents objected to, and this is all a pre-clear objects to when you're auditing him and he growls at you. They add tremendous significances into this, but all they object to is being there. Now, if you run SOPHC opening procedure, and you run it very definitely with that postulate. Get the fact that the wall is there. Get the fact that the chair is there. That something else is there. You're liable to knock your pre-clear practically flat. I'm not advising you to use this as part of opening procedure. It's a violent process. Now, you get almost any pre-clear and just have him stand up in the middle of the room and just say, get the idea to that empty space out in front of you there, that it's there. It's there, it's there. My goodness, his mother will show up, and 8 or 9 of his wives, and all sorts of things will show up all the way down the line. He'll have all kinds of people standing in front of him. They're all there, you see. But that's the only crime that theta can commit. That's a lie. You see, that theta can be there is a lie. And that's the only bad thing that anybody has ever done, is be there. Now, that's all actually that the GE is doing. He stands there. He's visible. He is being there. and we must have introduced a lie. The basic lie which is introduced is time. Now, it's interesting to note that it's the second postulate which persists, because persist means time, and it's the second postulate which introduces time, so this becomes elementary. Now we say, let's look at this one. Let's find this fellow who's awfully sick. Oh, he's terribly sick. Boy, is he a problem. Oh, he's a problem to himself, and a problem to his family, and a problem to his audience. Oh, he's a problem. He's terrific. Do you know that he must have had an original postulate that he was well before he could make a second postulate that he was sick? And do you know that the postulate that he was sick must have denied the postulate that he was well? And so his original sickness was a falsity, and he knew it at the time he made it darned well. He knew when he said he was sick that day to keep from going to school, he knew it, that it was a lie. He knew it was a lie, and he got a persistence of the sickness. And now here he is, 89 years of age and all crippled up, and we find out that the basic postulate was the fact that he was well, however. Now, how could sickness ever get any power except through wellness? Now, we look underneath every lie to find out that it was the truth, the static itself, which gave it power. The lie has no power because it is a perversion. Persistence has no power that is not based upon the static itself. So, we have the basic lineup at all times and in all places that the lie is empowered by truth. Truth must have existed, and a good condition or quality must have existed prior to a bad condition or quality, and vice versa. If a good condition is existing, very possibly the basic postulate was a lie. A bad condition. The basic postulate was a bad condition. All right. As we study the problem of goodness and badness in the world, we find out that we must be studying the second postulate because it is all that persists. If we have a situation which is very, very good, it probably was based upon a primer postulate which was bad. But do you know that you can't make a prime postulate which is a lie? If you'll just get the idea that there are no postulates, that you've made no postulates of any kind, that there are no postulates which have been made, now make a postulate. Now, can that postulate be a lie? Can that postulate be a lie? If you wiped out all postulates, you just said they don't exist, but you just laid them aside, you didn't even postulate them out of existence. Now you've made a prime postulate. That can't be a lie. All right, now make a second postulate denying the one which you just made. That's a lie. Now, which one of these two is going to persist? The second one. And where's it going to get its power? From the first one. So we are trying to cure somebody who has been jilted. We're trying to cure him, and we would then have to get him to postulate that he was in love. And this young man rushes in, and he is all ecstatic, and his head is going around in circles because of this gorgeous, gorgeous creature that he's just fallen in love with, and so he's going to hawk his father in order to take her out. Just what would we process on him to save father? What would we process? We would process his dislike of women. You see, it doesn't matter what the prime postulate is. We're not going on the basis of badness or goodness. A consideration is a consideration. The first consideration, the prime consideration as we call it, cannot be a lie until it is denied or masked or changed by a second consideration while still existing. So, you've got your second consideration there, which is the persisting one, and it deriving its power from the first one. This fellow says, I'm never going to fall in love, I'm never going to fall in love, I'm never going to fall in love, ever, and then he falls in love. Well, he gets it real bad, and this persists for a long time. And to audit it out, as I said, we would have to get him to postulate that he was in love. Now, do we mean reach back on the track and find out where we were going to get that? Reach back and straight wire it out? No, because there is no time. And all address to the past, every address to the past and every address to the future, actually, is validating a lie. There's only now. There's never been anything else but now, but there's a consistent change and a consistent series of postulates going on which gives a continuance of now, but the continuance of now is a lie. And so Of course, it's not very bad. You can move objects around, and that's quite honest. I mean, compared to a cross-contradiction, two kinds of lies there. And we discover that when we are trying to make a condition change, that we simply have to postulate, as though it exists in present time, the opposite condition. And we go on postulating it and postulating it and postulating it, and it will take place. But what happens is we postulate it. Why does a pre-clear get sick when he is sick and says, I'm well, I'm well, I'm well, I'm well? Because he's already running on the postulate that he's sick, of course. But much more important than that, he is sliding into the second postulate. He's making the first postulate that he's well, and sliding into the second postulate re-stimulates him. All he's got to do, though, is this a few times, and he will slide out of being sick. He has to do it a few times because he's got to undo the duration or get the time postulate out. In other words, he's got to create time with a postulate, the basic postulate, in order to recover from the second postulate. If anyone is being continuously sick, then, he is being continuously sick because he gave a counter postulate to being well. Therefore, we have him postulate, I am well, I am well, I am well, I am well. And we just don't get him to say that. We get him to feel well, you know, get the idea of being well, we'd say to him. The idea, believe me, he's going to get a lot sicker before he gets well because he keeps sliding into the second postulate. Now, we in Scientology go out and we tell the world, now look, be healthy, be strong, be bright, you can be exteriorized and so forth. And they listen to us, and for a moment they listen. And the next instant they feel kind of sick. You see, they're sliding into the second postulate. So we give them the first postulate, they go into the second postulate. We give them the first postulate. If we just told them that enough times and often enough and hard enough, they would slide permanently through the second postulate and wipe it out. And they would be well. All we do is have to keep telling them they're well. We would accomplish it that way. We'd make them run it out themselves. And so this is actually a very superior therapy. This is R240 in your processing, immediately derived from these various axioms. Wherever we have in Scientology a condition existing then, it must be deriving its power from a prior postulate of an opposite nature. In order to get a persistence continuance, we must have had a denying postulate. So we get somebody who hates the human race. He must have loved them desperately by postulate. You see? We get two brothers. There's a proof of this, by the way. There's no hatred as that which can exist between two brothers or a nation torn asunder in war. Well, that's because they loved each other so well, you see, and so they can hate with violence. But what is their hatred depending on? Their hatred's depending on the fact they loved each other. So if we have somebody hating madly, we would simply, let's say he's hating somebody named Bill, we would say, now get the idea of loving Bill. You go, now get the idea of loving Bill. 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 Oh, he's not too a guy. Get the idea of loving Bill. Get the idea of loving Bill. We wouldn't necessarily restore love for Bill, but we'd certainly run out the hatred for Bill. Not because we're running it off the track. Now let's get out of our minds right here and now the idea that we ever run anything off the track. We never do. We're running it in present time. We will never run it otherwise than in present time. And although we can address the track, we are actually validating time. And the more we validate time, the sicker our pre-clear is going to be. Okay.